I want to just start by thanking you, Secretary Rumsfeld, General Myers, and Secretary Wolfowitz for your strong leadership for our men and women across the world in the armed services and the battles that they're fighting every day to protect us from this jihadist threat. We're very appreciative of your time and your statements and your recommendations here for the 9/11 Commission. Secretary Rumsfeld, my first question for you is a simple one. Did you consider al-Qaeda to be a first-order threat? And particularly in the spring and the summer of 2001, how did you practice this priority?
I and others in the administration did consider it a serious threat. The intelligence correction. It goes back through history, their prior behavior, the statements that had been indicated by Senator Kerry, and the intelligence threat reports that one would read as we went along drove one to a conclusion that they were active, that they had been successful in some attacks, and that they were planning, talking, chattering, and hoping to do various types of damage. I tried in my remarks to lay out how we addressed the concern. One level was at the National Security Council level and the planning and the process there. A second was to address the department as a whole and see if we couldn't strengthen our special forces, strengthen our agility, develop the ability to move faster, to move with smaller elements rather than large footprints.
But the special ops were not used during that time period, correct?
Not against al-Qaeda. They were used in some other things, as I recall.
So with reference to al-Qaeda.
But the changes to special ops are still taking place. It'll take probably another year for the process for them to move from a supporting to a supported command requires them to develop the planning functions in key locations around the world and to rearrange themselves both with respect to their organizational structure and their equipment.
Let me put the question this way. And you're one that likes metrics, and I like metrics to try to measure what kind of effectiveness we're having. The Clinton administration, fairly or unfairly, used a metric to say during the millennium that they had a small group of the principals, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, the President of the United States, Mr. Clark, that would meet almost on a daily basis during that millennium and try to make sure that they were taking in the intelligence, responding to the terrorist threat, trying to push from the top down to the bottom decision-making on how to counter al-Qaeda. What was your method of trying to fight al-Qaeda from the DOD during the spring and summer when these spikes in this intelligence were coming in? You've got some very capable people. I see Mr. Cambone sitting behind you that is really very proficient in this. What were you doing, and how were you pushing that out to the different departments as the Clinton administration, for good or bad, successfully or unsuccessfully? I'm not saying their model was the best one.
Well, we did it differently. You mentioned the fact that they had a principals meeting that met frequently. Our arrangement, as Secretary Powell mentioned this morning, was to Colin and Condi Rice and I talked every morning. We tended to talk after our intelligence briefings. We were able to discuss the items that we felt were important and needed action. We had lunch once a week, in addition to all of the Principals Committee meetings and the National Security Council meetings. Internally, we did a great deal with respect to Paul Wolfowitz and General Myers and our team as it came on board in terms of focusing the department. But it was a different approach, just a fact.
To the metric of the Clinton administration, and again, we'll be talking to Mr. Clark tomorrow, probably grilling him on what the Clinton administration did right and did wrong. One of the metrics, again, for the Clinton administration was principals meetings and how many they had on a particular topic, right or wrong. Were there principal meetings on al-Qaeda and terrorism before September the 4th?
Well, there were certainly principals meetings where it was discussed, whether it was the sole topic or not. The records, you have those records and you would know.
Right.
I left out
Our
a couple-
records say no.
Is that
the first
right?
principals meeting on terrorism
Just
was
solely
not
on that
until
topic?
Until September 4th.
I should add a couple of other things that were going on. In addition to meeting with the President in the National Security Council meetings, I was meeting with the President every week separately, and unquestionably, as General Myers and I do it together almost always, and often Secretary Wolfowitz. The other thing we did was I made a decision early on that the single most important thing we could do that would benefit us in terms of these types of problems would be to develop an exceedingly close link with the Central Intelligence Agency and the intelligence community. And as a result, George Tenet, who I knew and respected, and I started eating lunch with either Paul or Dick Myers or Steve Cambone, and one or two of his key people, depending on the topic, and have done it consistently for the last 3 years. And we did it during that period. And it has, in my view, been critically important to link those two institutions together. And I do believe they are as well linked together today as probably ever in history.
I would say there's one other thing that the Secretary did as well, and that was when developing the QDR, which we had to start right after the Secretary came into office, by law, was to develop, as part of our strategy, articulate for the first time in my memory that we had to set aside forces for homeland defense. And it's the first time we've ever articulated that in our strategy, which set us up pretty well when we wanted to create Northern Command, because we'd thought about it up to that point. But that was just one example. I mean, there are lots of things we did in that area that were different.
We also, I forget the timing of it, but we worked to get the Congress to allow us to establish an Undersecretary for Intelligence that Dr. Cambone now sits in.
With respect to Dr. Albright's testimony this morning, some of us were critical of the Clinton administration's failure to respond to the USS Cole bombing. That took place, as you know, 17 sailors were killed on October the 12th, 2000. They had several months to deal with that. They had a CIA briefing in December, which was hedged, which wanted to try to point command and control to Osama bin Laden, although they said al-Qaeda was responsible. Why didn't we take action in the Bush administration? I know you said in your opening statement that it was old and stale. The terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in 1993, and then they came back 7 years later and attacked the same World Trade Centers. Stale and old and patience are words that I'm not sure, they're at least patience is in the jihadist lexicon. Why didn't we adopt to that kind of approach earlier, to say, we are going to make you pay a price for this. 4 months from now, 4 years from now, we're going to go after your camps. We're going to tell terrorists that come from Morocco or Algeria or other places, we may not get bin Laden with a cruise missile, but we're going to maybe get some people coming from other terrorist organizations. They're going to think twice before they come to a sanctuary.
Well, I wish that were the case. You can hit their terrorist training camps over and over and over and expend millions of dollars in U.S. weapons against targets that are dirt and tents and accomplish next to nothing. From a cost-benefit ratio, it just doesn't compute. Second, the risk, the bigger risk is that they will assume, again, that the United States is basically, that's all they can do, is to pop a weapon into a training camp, bounce the rubble another couple of times, and then stop. And we've seen enough of the terrorists that they have gone to school on us. They watched what happened in Somalia. They have watched various reactions to their activities and come to conclusions about it. And to the extent they think you're weak, they'll go after you. And to the extent they think you're not weak, and you put pressure on them, you complicate their lives. And we were, right or wrong, I and many of us were concerned that another missile attack after we get into office in February or March or April without having a policy, without having a plan that was different, distinctly different, would be a mistake and indeed a sign of weakness, not strength.
We've just heard, Mr. Secretary, from many people who have said that while these training camps may have been categorized as jungle gyms or playgrounds with swings, rope swings on them, that other people said that they were human conveyor belts of jihadists determined to kill Americans anywhere they could.
That's true.
So the cost-benefit ratio of a $1 million cruise missile to taking out some people that can come kill others was one we just didn't consider, I don't think, in the right kind of cost-benefit analysis in the long run. One final question. Again, Secretary Wolfowitz, this is, again, to be fair, and I want to shoot straight with you on this. We have Mr. Clark coming up tomorrow, and he has a reference in his book to an April 30th deputies meeting, where he claims, and we want to know if this is accurate or not so that we can ask him the direct questions tomorrow. He claims that in this meeting, when they're talking about a plan to go forward to go after bin Laden and al-Qaeda, that you brought up the subject of Iraq, and that you said you put too much attention on Iraq as a sponsor, as a state sponsor of terrorism, and not enough emphasis on al-Qaeda as a transnational sponsor of terrorism. I have just two comments or two questions on that. One would be, is that fairly accurate? Is his portrayal of that deputies meeting accurate at all, or accurate to some degree? And secondly, in an interagency meeting where dialogue and discussion of these things should take place, that's what the interagency process is about, isn't that where these discussions should take place? That opinions should be bounced back and forth and debate should be heated at times about the different threats to the world.
Thanks for giving me a chance to comment. Before I do that, let me just make a comment on the last exchange you had with Secretary Rumsfeld.
Please.
And it applies to quite a few comments, including Senator Gordon's question about the luxury of 7 months. I think there's a basic difficulty of understanding what a plan really is. A plan is not a military option. Military option is to a plan what a single play in football is to a whole game plan. And this notion that there's a single thing that if we'd only done it, it would work, is like a Hail Mary pass in football, which is what a desperate losing team does in a hope that maybe they can pull things off at the end. A plan has got to anticipate what the enemy will do next. It has to anticipate what the government of Pakistan will do. It has to anticipate what world reaction will be. It has to go down many pathways, and it's not a timetable. No one can tell you what's going to happen next. You have to be able to call plays and call audibles, and that's why to put a plan together in 7 months wasn't a long period of time. Even if we'd had everybody on board, it was actually rather fast. And I give you as an illustration, in 2002, in January, when the president said, okay, I want to see military options for Iraq, it wasn't until 9 months later, I believe, that he finally said, okay, I see that we have a military option against Iraq. And that still wasn't a plan, because that only allowed him to go to the United Nations and be prepared to use all necessary means. It wasn't a decision to use all necessary means, and General Franks' planning continued for another 5 or 6 months. So I think there's a failure to understand just how complex planning is. And we could get into this, but to Senator Gordon, I fail to understand how anything done in 2001 in Afghanistan would have prevented 9/11. And certainly, Congressman Roemer, the option you present of killing a few relatively low-level al-Qaeda in some camp in Afghanistan might have been a worthy thing to do as part of a general plan, but it certainly wasn't going to affect 9/11,
Well,
except as the Secretary said, to have made 9/11 look like a retaliation. So let's keep some clarity. But let me...
Perspective,
Yeah.
the point is we're not saying that you could have prevented or should have prevented with that particular one action, 9/11. We're saying that
Let's
there's
be
no
clear,
silver bullet. There are a host of
retaliation for the
that could
embassy
have been out
bombings
there.
did
There are a
nothing to
host
prevent
of
the attack
things.
on the Cole, right?
We're not just saying, a cruise missile going in Afghanistan. We're talking about the breadth of policy here, a Northern Alliance.
And Congressman,
covert
that's exactly what
operations,
took 7 months. We
cruise
started in
missiles.
April with a notion of
Okay, fair
attriting
enough.
the Taliban by assisting the Northern Alliance. By September, we said the goal is to eliminate Afghanistan as a sanctuary for al-Qaeda, a much more ambitious thing. With respect to Mr. Clark, and let me say, I haven't read the book yet. I was called by a reporter on the weekend with a quote from the book attributed to me. I tried to get the book. It wasn't available in bookstores. It was only available to selected reporters, and I got it yesterday, but I did not have time to read it in the last 24 hours. I'll get to it at some point. But with respect to the quote that the reporter presented as having been put in my mouth, which was an objection to Mr. Clark suggesting that ignoring the rhetoric of al-Qaeda would be like ignoring Hitler's rhetoric in Mein Kampf. I can't recall ever saying anything remotely like that. I don't believe I could have. In fact, I frequently have said something more nearly the opposite of what Clark attributes to me. I've often used that precise analogy of Hitler and Mein Kampf as a reason why we should take threatening rhetoric seriously, particularly in the case of terrorism and Saddam Hussein. So I'm generally critical of the tendency to dismiss threats as simply rhetoric, and I know that the quote Clark attributed to me does not represent my views then or now, and that meeting was a long meeting about 7 different subjects, all of them basically related to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. By the way, I know of at least one other instance of Mr. Clark's creative memory. Shortly after September 11th, as part of his assertion that he had vigorously pursued the possibility of Iraqi involvement in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, he wrote in a memo that, and I'm quoting here, when the bombing happened, he focused on Iraq as the possible culprit because of Iraqi involvement in the attempted assassination of President Bush in Kuwait the same month, unquote. In fact, the attempted assassination of President Bush happened 2 months later. It just seems to be another instance where Mr. Clark's memory is playing tricks.
You're doing pretty well for not having read the book, Paul.
I read the quote.
Okay.
Let me just say that
Congressman, we got to move on to
Okay,
next
let
commissioner.
me just say in conclusion, thank you for those remarks, and we do have Secretary Armitage in the private interviews with us saying that he thought that the committee process had not moved speedily before or after 9/11, the deputy meeting process and the process on a 7-month or 9-month plan.
Government doesn't move
So-
fast enough in general. I agree with that.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment also? I want to make certain there's no misunderstanding. I would have supported missile attacks on training camps anywhere had I believed that we could have achieved the goal that you suggest of killing jihadists. And the issue is that what happens is frequently we know that people are posted and they know when things are going to happen. And people empty those camps from time to time. In fact, we've seen reactions when ships or planes or missiles begin to go someplace that they go to school on that and move out. So the fact that a weapon costs a lot more than a training camp is no reason not to do it. The only reason for not doing it is if you, as I indicated, are working on a plan that you think is more comprehensive and you believe you can do a better job a different way.
Thank you.
In case I wasn't clear, I was not dismissive of al-Qaeda as a threat. The whole meeting was about al-Qaeda. I also believe that state support for terrorism was a problem, but I've never been dismissive of al-Qaeda. I think precisely because I think terrorism is such a serious problem, as I testified as early as my confirmation hearing.
Thank you.